Obviously, JavaFX framework makes it very easy and friendly to design the user input form and has natural support for creation of a controller class to handle the user actions and to access the window controls with these FXID gadget references that we provided inside the scene builder. So now is the time to add some business logic to our GUI front end. We could use our onClick update, right? So this is our onClick update handler method to modify some counter variable inside the controller class like this, right? So we could try to have some sort of counter, declare this variable somewhere as a private member inside the controller, increment the counter every time the user clicks the button, and update the contents of our label just like this. However, according to MVC architecture principles, the data cannot be changed outside the model tier. Likewise, we want this label counter, which is, by the way, our view, to be managed by the business tier. So the right step is to add the business object and name it perhaps something like model counter. So let's update our notes. Number 5 here would be to add the model counter class. So let's do this. Just go to the package, add new Java class, and this will be model counter, which is of course a silly name to use for a class, but I just want to emphasize that this is part of our model tier. And by the way, here in our demo we assume that our button and the label are the actual parts of the view tier. Okay, finish. So let's just get rid of some of these comments and the Java doc, and just go to this model counter, and here we can add our private integer counter. We can explicitly initialize it with 0, and then right click somewhere in this file and insert code, and pick to create getter and setter for this counter variable, just like this. So our plan is to have this model counter as a private data attribute inside of our controller, right? So we go to our controller and add model counter reference to the controller. And now instead of doing this, I'll just keep this as a reference in our comments. So instead what we're going to be doing is updating the model by using the counter reference, which is the reference to our business object, and using the getter and setter to update the value. At this stage, if we had this object in memory, this model counter, we would be updating our model according to the model view controller rules, but this is only half of the work. The model should be able to detect the update and notify the controller to update the view. So I will do this step by step, and then we will make a summary overview of everything in this demonstration. So keep this in mind. But right now, let's switch to model counter and add the listener interface and a list of listeners. All right, so just right at the top, I'm going to add a public interface named listener, which has a method to notify any part of our system that wants to know about the change in our counter value. And we will also keep the list of listeners, whoever that might be, in this array list. In fact, let's right-click and fix imports. Okay, so we have array list and list. Okay. And we will also add a method to add a listener anytime somebody wants to subscribe to the updates from the model. So they can add themselves to the list of listeners. So we can just put it right here. Okay, add listener, and we just add them to our list. And finally, we want to notify our observers or listeners about the data updates. So naturally, we do this from inside the setCount method. Here we can call something like notify observers. Now, if you click on the name and press Alt-Enter, it's giving you a chance to add a method to our class. So we're just going to do that. So this is the new method. I'll actually move it down here to the bottom of my class definition, like this. And we can now get rid of this unsupported exception, right? And so instead we're going to say listeners, which is the array list of listeners, and use Java Stream interface for each. And for each listener, we'll use this lambda expression to invoke this onChange method. And of course, the listeners will be implementing this method and will be notified about the update in our counter. At the time of the update, they will instantly have access to our model counter object and use its public methods like getCount, for example, to extract the new value and make it visible to the user. So let's now go to our controller class, fxCounterController, and insert the setter method for our model counter. I'll just right-click and go to Insert Code and generate the setter for model counter. Click Generate. And here, besides just setting the counter reference, we can add the listener which will update our label. Lambda expression to do the work. This expression will be captured by our interface listener, and whenever we call onChange, this code will be executed. So this lambda expression provides the code for the method onChange, and therefore anytime we call onChange while looping through the list of our observers or listeners, and our specific listener here wants to update the label. Okay, so I will try to make everything visible and resize my font a little bit so that everything fits on the screen, so you can see what I did in both the model class and the controller class. And I think for the purposes of our demo, I will just replace this. I'll just rename this method to, say, setModel, just to emphasize that this is the place where the model is set inside the controller. Okay, I'll save my changes that I made so far. And the only thing that's left to do is to take care of our initial setup in our main file. So here what we need to do is to set the model inside the controller. And before that, of course, we need to create the instance of the model counter. I'll comment out this line, the first line where we obtain our fxml graph root, and instead we'll just break it down to steps like this. Again, I'll adjust my font size so that everything is visible on my screen, perhaps like this. So this is what's happening when the application starts. So we're creating new fxml loader object, specifying our fxml file as a resource, then proceed to load the scene graph, so that's returned back as a root. Then we get our controller. Part of the load process is that the controller object is actually created and gets initialized, and so we just obtain a reference to it. Then we create an instance of our model, which is of course the model counter object. And then we call this new method setModel, so now the controller gets access to our model. And at the same time, part of setting up the model, we create a listener which will update our label when our data tier object, model counter, will decide to notify all of the observers about the change in its state, basically the update of the counter. So this is my latest update inside our start method. So let's save everything and test the application and observe how everything works. Okay, so this is our little window, and this time as I click update, you can see that the label gets updated with the new counter value.